Okay. Are we all ready to start? So, good evening everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'm Marie-Thérèse Rossi, the Chair of the Scrutiny Committee, as you know. And we're having the meeting in the Town Hall because regulations have been relaxed and we're allowed to hold in face-to-face meetings, but we're using this chamber as it is larger than some of the other rooms. This event is also being streamed on YouTube, and members of the public can listen into the meeting remotely, but they cannot participate. To keep everyone safe, can I remind everyone who is here to keep to their seats and to wear a face covering when they are moving about the chamber. And at the end of the meeting, could we all leave straight away and not chat to each other? So, moving on. So I would now like to welcome everyone who is watching remotely to the meeting, and I think it would be appropriate for us to start with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell fire tragedy. Thank you. Before we proceed with the meeting, I would ask members of the committee only to switch their microphones on when they have been invited to speak and to turn them off straight afterwards. And please remain seated when you are speaking. If any councillor wishes to speak and I have not called them, please raise your hand so to get my attention. I have apologies for absence from Adrian Beryl-Cox and Emma Will. Are there any declarations of interest from members of the committee? No? Okay, thank you. The minutes of the meeting of the 8th of July have been circulated. Does the committee agree that I sign them as a correct record? Okay.
Sorry, thank you. Have the suggestion that briefings, so towards the end of page 5, I made a suggestion that briefings that take place outside meetings or between scrutiny meetings, in accordance with the suggestions by the Centre for Scrutiny, that we should have information briefings available between meetings and not to take up the time of meetings. If that information provision happens between meetings, it's not recorded anywhere in terms of the meetings, but a way of doing it would be to provide a link from the minutes of the subsequent scrutiny committee on that subject just to the notes of the briefing outside the meeting, so that if somebody was interested in finding that data and that briefing, they could do it. It would be on public record rather than just being a briefing which has no record. I made that suggestion and I'm wondering whether that's been investigated?
Um,
If not, could it be investigated?
Jackie, is that feasible to do that?
Technically, it's certainly feasible. It's a question of whether it's the right protocol, I think.
We can look into it, but we have briefings for members and they're not recorded.
No, but we have part of the suggestion of the Centre for Scrutiny, as I understand it, by Ed Hammond, was that we should not take up the time in the meeting for briefings on regular information updates. But regular information updates are an important part of scrutiny, and therefore, if somebody is interested in finding that information, I think it should be on public record. Now, we do not have a mechanism for doing that at the moment, but a technical way of doing it would be in the minutes, there would be a link to the record of that briefing meeting, so that if people want a record of the scrutiny meeting, they can read that, and if extra information was asked for or is regularly provided, as suggested by the Centre for Scrutiny, that record would be made via a link, because it would be an economical way of doing it. The record would already exist in the briefing, from the briefing meeting, and it would be economic in time and effort to use the technology to link it into the subsequent minutes of that scrutiny meeting, be it OSC or one of the select committees. And I'm just suggesting we should look into it. I'm not suggesting we've got a fully baked idea here. I think we haven't got the time.
Okay, I think we'll take a note of that, but my feeling is that the minutes reflect what exactly happens during the meetings here, and that's what they should be. And if, you know, I don't have a problem with reports having links to other meetings, but I think minutes should stand alone, actually.
Well, I think, Madam Chairman, if I could suggest then, if you, I defer to that, but then could I ask that that Jackie Hurd talk with Ed Hammond about how this issue might be addressed in an alternative way?
We will, Councillor, and we may be able to link it actually into the committee work programme report, because it would link to what you're doing, so it might be better, as the Chair said, if it goes in there, but I'll definitely look into that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, notwithstanding that, and we'll take a note of that, can I sign these minutes? Okay? Yep. All right, thank you. So the first item on the agenda tonight, a very important topic of violence against women and girls, and our strategy on that. And as we know, you know, even in the last week or so, there's been another, you know, dreadful murder of a young woman just walking home or walking to the pub. So the report has been compiled by Stuart Priestley, and it provides details of work completed in support of the Council's Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. And committee members are asked to note the contents of the report and to ask questions later on. And I will now hand over to Stuart Priestley, the Chief Community Safety Officer, to give an introduction, and he will introduce his colleague as well.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As Madam Chairman says, this is a report which has been completed by myself, but mostly by my colleague Shabani, who I'll introduce in a minute. Concerns the next Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. The Council has prioritised tackling violence against women and girls for a number of years now, and in fact some of the work that we've undertaken as an authority and as a partnership has been recognised on a pan-London basis and indeed on a national basis. These insidious crimes are regrettably still with us, as Madam Chairman illustrated, and it's absolutely essential that we as a local authority are working proactively with VCS and with communities to respond to these crimes and to support victims to recover. I'm not going to say anything more, but I will hand over to my colleague Shabana Corsa, who is the subject matter expert and is the Violence Against Women and Girls strategic lead for the Council, and will just say a little bit more about the work that she's undertaken in regards to the next strategy and where we are. If I could hand over to you, Shabana.
Hi, good evening everyone. Thank you very much for letting me join today. I'm Shabana, I'm the strategic lead for ending violence against women and girls, and I'm currently working on our new strategic direction in terms of ending violence against women and girls and making our boroughs safe. What I wanted to do briefly, if I may, is perhaps just give a bit of background. I'm sure you've had a chance to read the report, but maybe just highlight some key points. And then what I really wanted to do was emphasise what our next steps are and how we're determined to address this locally as a priority and to get your support in doing so. And then perhaps lastly open the floor for any questions or any points that you would like to make. As you rightly said, Madam Chair, we know that this is a very serious issue. Violence against women and girls, or VAWG is the acronym, sadly is incredibly prevalent. We've seen a number of high-profile cases nationally, but we know this is something that's happening locally as well. I've included within my report a number of statistics which really paint quite a shocking figure. And in addition, in order to develop the strategy and better understand the needs in the borough, I undertook a consultation with residents which provided even more insight into the prevalence and need that we face locally. So just to kind of highlight a few of those points, and just to remind you that when we talk about violence against women and girls, we talk about a range of different types of behaviours that come under this umbrella term. Now this term itself is one which the United Nations has defined. It's something which the national government has adopted. It's something MOPAC and Pan-London partners have adopted, and it's something which we've adopted locally as well. The reason we use this term is because the type of abuses I'm going to highlight disproportionately impact women and girls. So that's not to say it doesn't affect men and boys and those who are non-binary. In fact, we know anyone can experience abuse, and our services and response must be inclusive for all. However, the reason we have used this term is to both align with national and international best practice, but to also really make space to recognise the disproportionality of which the last year certainly has highlighted the prevalence of violence against women and girls. And so this includes experiences of domestic abuse, rape and sexual violence, female genital mutilation, early and forced marriage, so-called honour-based violence, faith-based abuse, sexual harassment, stalking, trafficking, and then lastly, prostitution and sexual exploitation. So really, the strategy and our response is quite far-reaching. So very briefly, and I won't take up too much of your time here, but I wanted to just highlight local prevalence and then speak a little bit more about what we've done successfully and what we're going to be doing next. So in Kensington and Chelsea, as you can see from the report, from April 2020 to 2021, we saw 114 victims who were referred into our main specialist service. This is a 25% increase from the previous year. This is significant because we know that sadly lockdown and COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation. It certainly hasn't created more abuse, it's just shone a light, and what we'd like to think is by the raising of awareness, we've encouraged more people to come forward and report. So the issue was always there. It's just suddenly there's a spotlight on the issue itself. And within the same period, 329 victims were identified as at high risk of immediate harm. And what we also are seeing is increasing complexity of need. So victims are no longer coming forward solely for support with the abuse they're experiencing, but we're seeing experiences of multiple disadvantage. And what that means is that they need increasing support with their mental health, they need increasing support with substance use services, they need increasing support around housing, language, etc. So this strategy is very much a multi-agency strategy. No one partner can lead this work, it's got to be done in collaboration, and I've very much highlighted that joined up working within the report through an approach we call our coordinated community response. And what that basically means is ending VAWG is everyone's business, not just statutory partners, but voluntary partners, businesses, faith groups. So how do we come together to best meet the needs of victims and their children? Would it be helpful maybe just to spend a couple of minutes talking about what we have done, because I'm conscious I'm painting quite a heavy picture, and we've actually been, as Stuart said, done a number of really brilliant pieces of work locally which have been recognised not just nationally but which is great across Europe as well. So some of the things that we've been working on includes developing whole system-wide approaches to violence against women and girls, which includes working with health partners, it includes working with children's services, and it includes working with schools. What we've also successfully done is developed a program of working to ensure consistency, and that's something which we've done nationally and also across on a European level. So we managed to secure some EU funding to develop a program of work that creates consistency in terms of the appropriate response to violence against women and girls. And then lastly, as part of our response during COVID, we ran a number of high-profile events, activities and campaigns to really raise awareness. The aim of this work really is to make sure that we shine a continued spotlight on this issue. Our concerns is that as we emerge from lockdown and go back to the new normal, whatever that is, violence against women and girls may slip off the agenda, and so we really want to keep it high on the priority list, and this is why this VOG strategy is so important. And so that's kind of let me sort of neatly segue to the strategy itself. One of the things which we were very keen to do was make sure that no one person or agency develops a strategy, but it's a collaborative approach. And so what we've done is we've worked with a number of different organisations, and indeed in the report I've highlighted the governance structure which oversees this work, and we've all collaboratively come together to identify a joint shared understanding of need and a response. And so in terms of wider consultation as well, I mentioned that we have done a resident survey, so we understand directly from people who are living, working, travelling through the borough, how safe they feel, what they believe our priorities should be. But a key part of this work has also been to speak directly to survivors of VOG. And this is important because we know that survivors are actually experts through experience, and that experience must be captured within our strategy. And so that leads me to talk very briefly about the strategy itself and what we're hoping to develop. I'm in the process of developing it at the moment, but I wanted to give you a brief overview as to what the strategy will consist of, what our priorities are, and what we're hoping to do. So, if you refer to the proposed strategy content, we will have a clear introduction which will set out the aim of the strategy, how it will be co-produced with survivors and different professionals, and it will also include a quick guide for different agencies to see which part of the strategy is most relevant to them. Then we'll move on to really explaining what is violence against women and girls, why it happens, and a key part of the strategy is to also myth bust. We're conscious there are a number of myths out there in relation to this topic, so we want this strategy to raise awareness as well as encourage action. So then we'll move on to have a dedicated section in the strategy around what experts through experience have told us. So the people who've experienced abuse, who've gone through services and have their experiences to share. We've got a dedicated section in the strategy there for them to tell us what they believe we should be doing. Also, the report, the strategy even will include a local picture just to really set out the data profile of violence against women and girls. Then it will move on to what is our approach, and I briefly mentioned our coordinated community response, and this will be captured through a theory of change model which will set out what we want to achieve and what will be the necessary steps to get us there. And then the main bulk of the strategy will be our priorities, and these are, again, what we've developed alongside partners, residents, and also survivors, and there are 4 priorities that the strategy will consist of. The first one is to make sure that we prevent violence against women and girls. So we're acting proactively. We're not just being reactive. So we're raising awareness, we're working with young people, we're working in schools, we're challenging some of the harmful attitudes that underpin violence against women and girls, but in a collaborative way. The second objective, priority, is that victims are supported. And what that means is that the victims get the right support at the right time and it meets their needs. And this will be, again, across the board so that different agencies understand the role that they play. A key part of our strategic direction is making sure that partnership working is undertaken to end violence against women and girls. So how are we working together? How are we sharing information? How are we ensuring that we collectively are meeting the needs of victims, survivors, their children as well? And then lastly, and a really key part of the strategy, and again you can see a shift happening nationally in terms of this conversation as well, which is how do we hold abusers to account and how do we offer them the relevant support to change behaviour? Because ultimately we need to be more proactive in how we engage with perpetrators. So those are the 4 priorities, and the sort of latter part of the strategy will focus on an action plan, how we plan to get there, and then the appendix will also include a list of approved terminology and a page of resources as well. And then lastly, a really key part of the strategy is for it to be interactive. I know strategies can be quite heavy and not always the most accessible, so it will be embedded with short videos and clips, with interviews with our partners, with counsellors around why this is a priority for us and what our response will be. So I think that's everything from me. I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just start with one question and then I'll come to Councillor Evans. It says an estimated 2 million adults between 16 and 59 years experience domestic abuse. There's no information about the older cohorts, and presumably that it's something that doesn't, that carries on, and perhaps even in the elderly might actually get worse with dementia and all the rest of it. So I just wondered if you could say something about that.
Yeah, indeed, that's a very good point. So we know that, as I mentioned, anyone can experience the types of abuse as I listed, but there are certain groups who have those additional vulnerabilities and who face those additional barriers in terms of accessing support. I've mentioned it briefly in the report, but I'm happy to expand on it much more in the strategy. And what we know is that older people, we know that disabled people, we know that people from racially minoritized backgrounds, people from the LGBT community, because of the additional barriers they may face in accessing services, sadly we see quite high numbers of these types of abuses. And so one of the things which we are going to stress very much in our strategy is what does it mean to end FORG in adopting an intersectional approach, so understanding the intersectional needs of victims and to raise that awareness so that people and professionals understand that anyone can experience abuse and to look out for those vulnerabilities. So that will very much be stressed in the report and is an important point. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Evans.
Thank you very much for your report. I did attend the VOG conference that was held here, and there were many organizations. I was really impressed.
Great.
Tell us 2 things. One, where is the weak link where people may fall, not get into the system? Because there's a lot of theoretical information going on here, but the time frame is always worrying to me, especially with domestic abuse going up and violence against women going up. So what would you say, where is the weak link there?
So I think what we know is that in order to really protect those who experience abuse and to prevent it, we've got to take an approach which looks across the life journey. So we've got to be working in a preventative capacity with young people, so raising awareness of what is appropriate and inappropriate behaviours, challenging where necessary harmful attitudes and beliefs. And then it's very much looking across the board. It's tricky because there's no one place that we should be particularly focusing. It's got to be across the board. So we've got to be working preventively. We've got to work in a way around early intervention as well. So when we do come across somebody who needs support, we actually identify the abuse quite early on. We ask the right questions. We offer support before it gets to that crisis, that place of crisis. But having said that, we've also got to make sure we have that provision for when it does get to crisis. There were many statistics which I didn't include in this just for brevity, but we also know that sadly victims of abuse will experience abuse up to 35 times before reaching out for support. And that's for a number of reasons, particularly around shame, fear, being made to believe it was their fault. And so our approach needs to be a response, but it also needs to be about that myth busting I mentioned, so that we're not victim blaming, we are believing victims when they come forward, and we create a zero tolerance approach to abuse.
Thank you. And one more thing, because I'm always concerned about communication. There was talk of an interactive website so you have all of this provision. How can victims, can they access that website? Can they call for help on that website?
Yeah.
What is the mechanism in place on that?
Sure. And this is a really important point because we want information and support to be available as soon as someone needs it. They shouldn't have to sort of navigate through different websites. Locally, we've actually commissioned a service called the Angelou Partnership. I've mentioned it in the report, but I'll highlight their service. So the Angelou Partnership is a collective of 10 different agencies, each with their own specialism, and they've come together to form one larger partnership. So they have one website, one helpline number clearly highlighted on that, as well as on some of our posters and our information. And anyone can call that number, and depending on their level of need and support needs, they are referred onto a specialist partner within that. So to give you an example, one of our partners is Al Hassaniya, which some of you may be familiar with, which works with,
so.
yes. So if we have a woman who comes forward and she has additional needs, perhaps language barriers, she needs a service that understands her cultural background, she will be referred on to Al Hassaniya. And this is really important. So the one service anyone can access, and they will then be signposted, well, they will then be referred to where they need to go. So they don't have to navigate through, they will be clearly shown through that service. And what's brilliant about the Angelou Partnership is it's actually been, as Stuart said, nationally recognised as best practice, and we've been approached by a number of different partners, including the Home Office, to have a conversation around how that model can be replicated up and down the country. So we're really proud of the work we do locally, but we know that we need to do more, and this strategy is setting out what more we need to do, particularly in relation to survivors who have, as I mentioned, that multiple need, meeting their mental health needs, if they're using substances to cope, which sadly we know is very much the case, as well as housing, counselling, etc. So this is an ambitious but realistic strategy, but we know we need to do more, and coming here and highlighting it to yourselves hopefully can continue the emphasis we need to place on it.
Thank you.
Councillor Hammond. Councillor Hammond.
Thank you, Chair, and Shabana and Stuart, thanks very much for bringing forward this very important report and for the work you're doing on it. I'd just like to follow up on Janet's question, please, on how this is operationalised, because this is clearly a strategy and therefore, by its nature, it's a high-level report. And you mentioned a touching, glancing blow on the Angelou Partnership in the paper, and you've just described it as an umbrella of 10 different groups. Is that the partner, or are there other partners beyond Angelou that come together under this strategy? Could you say a bit more about
Yes.
the operationalising of it? And I'll give you the second question, which is a point of detail. I'm sure I know the answer to this anyway, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Paragraph 4.1, it says, the recent Domestic Abuse Act 2021 places additional duties on local authorities. Can you tell me what, if any, resource implications this has, and what resources has been provided by Her Majesty's Government with
Yes.
this new task?
Of course.
Thank you.
So in terms of your first question, absolutely. We have the Angelou Partnership, but we have our broader Violence Against Women and Girls Partnership as well. So the diagram, which I've included, the governance structure you'll see, outlines a strategic Violence Against Women and Girls board. This is attended by executive directors, leads, heads of service, and they feed into our statutory board. So the issue is very much high on the agenda. But the key point around operational response that you've highlighted is that the strategic board is informed by 6 operational groups. Now, those operational groups have specific areas of need that they focus on, and they work very proactively on the ground. So we've got the Modern Slave and Exploitation Group, which I believe was an item agenda a few meetings ago. We have the Harmful Practices Operational Group, so that's looking at practices such as so-called honour-based violence, forced marriage, faith-based abuse. We've got the Risk and Review Operational Group, and this is a dedicated space to look at, tragically, our domestic homicide reviews. and also our MARACs, which are our multi-agency risk assessment conferences, so those at high risk of harm. We have a dedicated space for our specialist services. Now, this is important, and it links to your follow-up point around the duties. It's brilliant that violence against women and girls is getting that national recognition, but a key point that we have done quite well locally and I want to continue doing is to include the expertise of grassroots specialist services. So this work was born out of that movement, it was born out of activism, and it was born out of human rights movements. We want to connect and stay linked up with that grassroots approach, and the specialist services is a dedicated operational group for those conversations and those concerns to be raised for the broader partnership to respond to. We've also got a children and health operational group, as we recognise the impact on young people, particularly in light of the new Domestic Abuse Act, which recognises that children are not witnessing abuse if they grow up in an abusive household, but are experiencing it. And then lastly, we have the housing operational group. So this partnership response really oversees a range of different works. It kind of sits behind the scenes and is a bit of a framework to ensure the work continues. The Angelou Partnership is the front of house and is what we promote for victims and survivors. But alongside that, we've got a number of additional projects which I'm involved in, including the whole health approach, whole school approach, so a number of other projects that we run alongside that. So it's a really busy area of work. There's a lot going on, and what's brilliant is that there's a lot happening on multiple levels, which is what needs to very much be the case. If I haven't answered that, do let me know if I've missed something off, but before I forget your second question, the Domestic Abuse Act and duties. So the duties, there are a range of duties, and in fact we held an event a few months back to outline what those duties are, and it has been recorded, so I'm happy to share them if people are interested to watch them. And it highlights, particularly for us, new duties placed on housing around safe accommodation. We have been, as all local authorities have been, awarded a small fund to support those duties to come into force. But I think your question speaks to a broader issue, which is now that domestic abuse, violence against women and girls is more and more high up on the agenda. I do think it would be helpful, and these are the conversations that we have at the VORG Strategic Board, around what does those ongoing funding questions look like. So we have allocated budget for this work. I'm sure Stuart can speak more to that. And we have commissioned services, but we're always having to make sure we're meeting need, and that does mean allocating and finding additional funding as we go on. So I'm pleased with our local response, but as I mentioned, I know we need to do more, and the government also recognises that more needs to be done. They've found some funding, but we're hoping that more will come, because it's quite challenging, I would say, yeah.
I would just add one point to the first question, and that is that our approach is very much a systemic approach, and not only those, if you look at the 4.2, the governance structure, I think it's also worthwhile just considering those boxes on the top which represent the strategic groups. So very much looking at the links into adults and children safeguarding and the health and wellbeing board, and the recognition kind of that statutory partners as well are key within this whole systemic approach to tackling VORG. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both of you, very comprehensive.
Thank you. This is such an important topic that everyone wants to ask a question. So if you just bear with me, I'll try and take you in order. So I think it's Councillor Pascal next.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Shabana and Stuart, for presenting this. I think this is an extremely important paper. I welcome the report and the work that you and partners do on the subject, and I'm very glad that you're working with the Angelou Foundation. Both my wife and I have come across them before in previous work that we've done. I think that the point that I would like to outline is to do with granular implementation in a slightly broader and different direction. And if you bear with me, I went to a seminar recently between two primary schools, which I'm governor of both in the borough, chairman one and sitting on the other. And this was on LGBTQ+, if I get that term correct. And it was essentially aimed at teachers and professionals within the school, but the governors also were asked to attend as well. And the strategy that was outlined there is that the important thing is that we all understand the issues that are there to do with equalities, safeguarding, and a whole number of other dimensions. And that we, the governors and the teachers and the support staff and the cleaners and the people in the kitchen and everybody understand that. And that those teachers then are not given extra duties, but they're given extra responsibilities to do in their normal work by better understanding of what they do. And it's not just in terms of how they teach, but it's how they re-procure books for the library, and how they talk with the parents, and how they listen to the kids talking about their parents, and it has dimensions into safeguarding with families and so on. And all of this is sort of measured and recorded where required under GDPR, etc., under CPOMs and all the other kinds of things that are used in schools. And then another dimension that reminded me that talk about the King's Fund, talking about health and well-being in the community, is something that if the community doesn't do 85% of, services who can only deal with acute and long-term conditions can only do 15%. So 85% has to be done by the community, but with the right skills and knowledge. Now, the way to bring these two thoughts together is one little realization that in this borough alone, in primary schools, we have 180,000 hours of pupil contact by teachers per week. So it is an incredibly powerful dimension. They're not going to be talking about this subject all the time, but if they bring this into what they do all the time, the sheer granular power of that across the borough within our primary schools, and the discussion that we had on the LGBTQ plus discussion went into the need to start at rising threes in the early stage of a nursery school, because that's where the conversation starts with the parents. And in fact, if one could get pre-birth, it would be even better, but that's not going to be very, very easy to do. But the point I'm making here is that if the right knowledge was imparted to every teacher in the borough, there wouldn't need to be more resources in that. There'll be resources to do that activity, but there wouldn't need to be more resources in what they do every day. But they would do what they do with a high level of knowledge and understanding, and they could impart that to the children and also to the parents that they come across. And they have roughly 15 minutes a week contact with every parent. So if that thought is of interest as a dimension, I'd be very happy to talk about it outside this meeting.
Yeah, I mean, that would be very welcome. We recognise that schools play such a powerful role when it comes to sort of identifying and supporting children. And I think what we're really keen to do is to, I suppose, just conscious of the constant pressure on schools to sort of cover a number of social justice issues, is to link them up with that expertise as well.
But what used to, 10 years ago when I started being a governor, what used to be a possible indication of occasional children who might be vulnerable for county lines and FGM and so on when they go to secondary school from primary is now something we watch for in the middle of primary school. Because of social media, etc., that's come forward about 3, 4, 5 years in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
It's a really frightening change of the paradigm that we're all facing. So I welcome a conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just sort of quickly off the back of that point, I think this goes back to how, as part of our strategy, we want to create a culture change. So we're having those conversations and we're having them in public spaces. One of the things we know, sadly, about violence against women and girls is there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to the types of abuses, and they can remain hidden. So the numbers we are seeing, we believe, are very much the tip of the iceberg. So absolutely, how do we utilise existing resource and raise that awareness? But then also on the flip side, just be conscious that in raising that awareness, we'll see more people coming forward, so we need to make sure we then commission services to then respond to that need. But absolutely, it's about changing that culture and engaging with partners who have that access.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Kazim and then to Mo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Shapana and Stuart, for the great report, and we do really appreciate the support you've been given to the victims, of course, and the strategy and the report that you've just given us. As we all know, of course, violence against women and girls is a violence against all of us, and the work you do is important. Any human being with decent heart will understand that this should never have happened, but if it happens, the support mechanism has to be there. We remember from what happened last month, this is closer to home, W11, the incident where a woman, 17-year-old woman has been killed, has been stabbed to death in the borough, north of the borough, Notting Hill area. And without naming names, I understand there were other women and children who were there at the scene and survived. And what support have they been offered? For example, what is the connection between the departments that you're leading and the housing team, as well as the communities team, and the mental health issue, not just the women and the girls who have been the victims, but also the people who have caused these problems? What their mental state, what can be done to support them in the long term to prevent this type of problems and violence against women and children?
Yeah, I think your point is really important around the wider impact and ramifications of violence against women and girls, and particularly thinking about friends and family as well as neighbours. In the work that we do, one of the interesting shifts I think that we've started to make is absolutely have literature that is aimed at encouraging anyone who's experiencing abuse to come forward. But what we've also started to do is have that wider conversation with concerned parties. You know, are you worried about somebody? Are you concerned? What we really want to do is kind of empower bystanders to be more proactive, and in coming forward be able to access support not just for victims but also for themselves. So we have a number of broader and wider services that we connect to outside of the violence against women and girls agenda, that are accessible for people who've witnessed crime, who are affected by that crime, and would like some support with that. And in terms of thinking more around those who abuse and those who are perpetrators of abuse, I think what we really want to sort of highlight to them is that, well, firstly, you know, there is no excuse for abuse, but there is support. And if people want to change their behaviour, and it's got to be a choice that one makes, you can't force them onto programmes and force them to change behaviour. You know, there are national services and there are some local. We need more local services, but we are hopeful that the new national perpetrator strategy that the government is working on is going to support us to better improve our local response, because that's one of the things that we were kind of missing a little bit, that national drive. But that's currently being developed by the government, and that will help us strengthen our local response to perpetrators. But our response has got to be for everyone. And I think what I'm hoping the strategy will do is highlight that ending violence against women and girls is everyone's responsibility, everyone's business. The more we talk about it, the more we myth bust, the more we can encourage people to get support. And one of the other statistics which we are conscious of is that before victims and survivors do ever access a service, they will share their concerns, their experiences with friends and family. And so how are we upskilling friends and family who receive that disclosure and don't know what to do? And so a key part of our messaging is around that wider awareness on the role that everyone plays. So it's definitely multifaceted. There's definitely a range of different approaches we need to take, but working with partners, as you've just said, is a key part of that. So, for example, as part of our whole health approach, one of the things that we successfully managed to do was make the case to our mental health trust to recruit a domestic abuse advocate who was actually co-located within the mental health trusts. Now that's brilliant, because it means when people are accessing those services, you've got a specialist expert based in the trust who can identify those additional needs, but also upskill other mental health professionals to be able to respond. And so what we're keen to do as part of our response is make that space for that specialist service, those grassroots organisations we spoke about, but also as part of that upskill a range of different professionals to identify and appropriately respond. And that's something which has been our priority and will continue to be so in the new strategy.
Another question. Okay.
Just follow up, thank you. In terms of, I think Stuart hopefully will answer this one, if that's okay. In terms of the incident that happened in Notting Hill around W11, are there anyone contacted you with support? For example, a woman who survived the actual the stabbing. Thank God she hasn't been specifically injured, but she has survived, and we understand her and her family have gone through a tough time. Have you been dealing with families, especially women and children, who've been in that incident? And that's one. The second point is, I understand how tough is housing in RBKC and across the country, for that matter. Is there any allocation specifically for women and children who have been subjected to violence, quota or spaces that they can immediately be deployed to, rather than just going into the different areas of the borough or even outside of London?
Thank you. In regards to the first question, the family who are affected, I haven't been had any contact, but I am aware that the police would have been responding to that via their family liaison officer, and they will consider a range of different needs, including mental health needs. I will happily follow up and get a bit more detail and email you on that, Councillor Ali. And then your last question was in regards to housing.
That's right, housing and allocation specifically for women, violence against women and girls.
So violence against women and girls is recognised as, Shabana will help me out here, but it is recognised as a need as part of the assessment for housing, as part of the Council's housing needs assessment process. It's part of the criteria for housing in needs, isn't it?
Yep, that's right. And the new Domestic Abuse Act automatically places a priority on those people who experience domestic abuse when it comes to housing. So this is a national change that we are currently implementing locally. So if somebody is in need of safe housing and they're experiencing domestic abuse, they will and should be viewed as a priority. One of the other things that we are linked into is something called the Pan-London Housing Reciprocal. Sadly, we know sometimes it's not always safe to stay in borough, and it may be safer to move, particularly to escape the abuser. And as part of this Pan-London Reciprocal, we have systems set up with other local authorities where if we refer somebody to live in their borough, a space is made available for somebody from their borough. So it's a brilliant scheme, which is not something, unfortunately, which we've developed ourselves, but we're a part of. But the new duties certainly will see a change when it comes to housing, and that's the additional funding that the government has allocated in regards to the domestic abuse duties. One of the things that we have locally, which is very important, and again, is actually recognised as an area of best practice, is our whole housing approach. And what that basically means is working across the housing sector to understand the role that housing play in identifying and responding to abuse. So not just looking at social care, although that's a key partner, but looking at the private rented sector, looking at sanctuary schemes, looking at every sort of department within anything to do with housing, and to try and help them identify the role that they play. Sadly, a few years ago in Kensington, Chelsea, we did have a homicide, and the woman who was sadly killed by her partner, when their home was in the process of being sold, and the estate agent who met both the victim and the perpetrator was quoted to have said she wouldn't want to be left alone in a room with him. And that's a really powerful statement, and what we wanted to do with the whole housing approach is, if you feel that way, what do you do about it? And that's the kind of change we want to make. And thankfully, as a result, locally we've adopted both the whole housing approach, but also DAHA, which is a Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and includes training of all frontline housing professionals, including people who go into homes to make repairs, because often they're the ones who go in and see broken, walls, smashed windows, and they're the ones who can report back to safeguarding teams what they're finding. So, yeah, there's a lot to do, and I'm conscious I've only given you a snapshot, so come and speak to me and we'll find out more about what we're doing, but more that we can do as well.
Councillor Bakhtiar.
Thank you, Chair. We all agree that the document is good and what you are doing is very good. Your departments are doing a fantastic job. Thank you. We have found ourselves in the Council and Londoners faced with thousands of new immigrants arriving last month. And I believe we have 800 of them in our borough in locations called by the Home Office bridging accommodations. This is a strategy, and these guys could be here for up to a year because it's difficult to relocate thousands of them elsewhere in the country, and some of them might stay permanently in the borough. Do we have, I was expecting a package special designed for them since it's easy to access them and find them in one or few locations. Did you prepare a package for raising awareness is a big thing. I am very much involved with them. I visit them daily. I talk to them. I do whatever they need, linking them to other services provided. And I have noticed lack of coordination. We have council officers and volunteers, but there is no coordination in there. Are you involved in this? And have you, or are you going to design a package to raise awareness? There are large families, 20, 30 families consisting of nearly 200 people in 25 to 30 families. So do you have something designed for them?
The council is, the council has mobilised its resilience apparatus and has set up a process involving adults, children, housing, customer services, mobilised and colleagues in finance, so very much mobilised a cross-authority response to the new Afghan arrivals, which are based within the 3 hotels within the borough. And that's been in place now for a couple of weeks since they've arrived. So there are council officers there all day, every day. They are undertaking a comprehensive kind of assessment of the needs of the new arrivals to understand what their needs are and what we as an authority need to do to respond to their needs. So that's a process which is, the assessment process is sort of concluding about now, but there's been, at the same time, there's been a number of activities to try and meet those needs, be them practical needs for clothing and toiletries and those type of needs, as well as working with health partners to ensure that the any medical needs are met, and also working with CNW around the mental
Sorry,
health.
Stewart, I'm aware of this. My question was about raising awareness about violence, because we have girls and women in there. They are culturally shocked. We were not planning to come here, and they suddenly found themselves in here. Do we have any things designed for them to raise their awareness?
Yeah. So the principal need has been around what I've just described to you. There is a recognition, and I had a meeting with the borough commander today about this, that the new arrivals may face some challenges and some issues from a community safety sort of perspective. The one concern that springs to mind is that they may be victims of hate crime when they're out in the street, and we need to be able to respond to that. They may also be groomed by gangs into kind of criminality, and because of their vulnerability and the very traumatizing experiences that they've gone through. So we need to be able to respond to that. And we also need to be able to respond to domestic abuse. So in answer to your question, the short answer to your question is, yes, we are working on plans bespoke to try and meet the needs of the community, but we're doing it at such a time in conjunction with the work that's being undertaken to understand what those needs are. So we need to be able to understand those needs and then to be able to respond to them. What we're also doing as well is working with the voluntary and community and faith sectors who are very much involved in delivering the response to support them to understand what to do if they have a community safety concern, be it being out on the street with some of the new arrivals and they're abused. If there is a concern around domestic abuse or criminality or substance misuse or any other kind of concern that from a community safety perspective they may highlight, knowing where they can access support in order to be able to respond appropriately. So very much is an emerging picture of need, but certainly from community safety side, my colleagues in the police and the colleagues within the community safety team are working to put measures in place. But as I say, it's a sort of an emerging area of need for us. And that will include domestic abuse. And from what I've just said, I wouldn't want anyone to think I'm prejudging the behaviour of any of our new arrivals. It's just that we just need to be aware of the pressures and the tension, the trauma that they've been through and their vulnerabilities. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I'll just come in a little bit as well. I mean, I think it's really, your question is very, very important. And I think as part of the wider work that Stuart is doing, I agree. I think understanding that need before rushing in and assuming what is needed is really important. So hearing directly from the new arrivals, what is it that they need? And then to be led by that need is definitely the approach. As part of this work that we do with grassroots communities, we know that there's some brilliant charities that are there on the ground. And I do believe that when it comes to engaging with communities from different backgrounds, it's about utilising those existing networks and those specialist organisations as well. One of the things that I'm conscious of that this does highlight is a broader problem that we nationally face, which is lack of resources for people who have no recourse to public funds. You know, that's definitely an area of need that we've identified. There's some work trying to be done to sort of meet that need, but we know there needs to be more. So we definitely want to have those conversations, better understand that need. But a really key point which I want to highlight is also how we can connect with women and girls who've recently arrived in this country and to get ideas from them on what they want. Because absolutely people have experienced abuse and trauma, but we also understand there's some amazing resilience and some ideas and some suggestions that will come directly from those experts. And so we don't want to come up with all the answer, we want to be led by that expertise, because I believe what Afghan women have gone through in the last 20 years shows the strength of their mettle, and I believe that there's a lot we can learn from them as to how we can make our boroughs safer for women and girls. So definitely keen to provide that support, but to also learn from their expertise, because I think they would have some profound insights into more of the work that we can do.
I'll come to Marwan and then David.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for this comprehensive report, and well done for all these different issues and stakeholders you're trying to reach and coordinate within that framework. That's really good. I commend you on that. What's here come to mind in this report is you mentioned the COVID. And we had the COVID, I mean, almost for 2 years, and you are developing this plan for the next 5 years. And in the content, I did not see any consideration for the impact of COVID because of self-isolation, people working from home, and all this being put together has created a massive impact on behavior. And so don't you think it will be good to incorporate this in your strategy to see the impact of COVID, as you mentioned there, in the contents of your proposed future document as an improvement? Because I think it's quite good to see the separation. So I would like your comment on that, please. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And the thing about COVID is that we're still feeling the effects of it, and we're still trying to fully understand what has been the impact. So our data, as we've been trying to analyse it to understand need, has been very sporadic, and it's very difficult to actually fully, whilst in the midst of it, understand exactly what is going on. But what we do know, as I mentioned very briefly, is that we're seeing an increase in referrals. And so the key thing which I want to highlight in this strategy is our response when we inevitably see more people come forward. And that, I believe, has been the key impact of COVID. Despite it being horrendous for many, for lack of a better word, the one positive that came out of COVID was that light that it shone on these types of abuses. It very much got into the public limelight. It was on the news. People were talking about it. And for me personally and professionally, that was so welcome, because for a very long time I found that sometimes, because of competing priorities, violence against women and girls may have slipped off, when we talk about a number of other crimes, but this very much highlighted that we need to talk about it. And some of the statistics that we have seen as well, particularly around the number of women killed, we know it's 2 women a week who are killed, and just this year in the UK we've had 106 women who've been killed by a male partner. So it's in the limelight, and it's placed an emphasis on Vogue. It's also highlighted, and I mentioned this briefly in the paper, the new need we're seeing as well. So I mentioned that the mental health needs, substance use, that's been compounded because of COVID. And so our response needs to not just focus on violence against women and girls, but violence against women and girls and broader social inequalities, social injustices, and experience of disadvantage. So I feel like I've kind of made the reference throughout, but perhaps you're right, there needs to be a more clearer focal point on COVID, which I'm happy to incorporate, because it's definitely, I was gonna say it's changed the landscape. It hasn't, because Vogue has always existed, but it's definitely shone a spotlight. And for me, again, just to echo what I said earlier, the biggest concern is making sure that it doesn't slip off the agenda as soon as we go back and we are no longer on lockdown and people forget that this is happening in homes. I think the other point, and sadly, thinking again about the number of high-profile cases we've had in terms of women being murdered, sort of just walking to see friends, it's also highlighting that our streets need to be safer, but also recognising that women and girls are more at risk of harm in their homes by someone they know than someone they don't know. So absolutely raising awareness, but just highlighting some of the statistics and prevalence that we're seeing. Women are still more at risk than someone they know than they don't know. And so our response needs to be mindful of that. And I think your point around COVID definitely reinforces that, because lockdown was happening when people were locking down when there are abusers. So yeah, happy to really draw that out in the report. Thank you.
David.
Stuart, thank you. Shabana, thank you. Much of my question was actually taken with that last one. But I recall 18 months ago, at the beginning of lockdown, discussing with the Executive Director of Families and Children's Services about the real concerns, there was going to be an increase. Why are you finding it so difficult to get hard evidence that there has been an increase? I think that would be my question.
So it's definitely been tricky trying to get hold of that absolute data. There have been a number of national surveys that have been done, particularly by Women's Aid, and that's been really brilliant at showing that increase in need and people reaching out. What we have found is that when people do come forward, there are certain types of support that they're accessing more than others. So to give you an example, if you're in lockdown with an abusive partner, it might not be safe for you to then engage with a specialist service in case your session with your key worker is overheard, if you're unable to get time to yourself. However, it's safer to call a helpline number and to get some support in that instance. So for that reason, we're seeing different types of data, but what we are consistently seeing is that the people who are coming forward are asking for support for additional need. So we're seeing that multiple disadvantage, the need for mental health support, the need for substance use as well. need for safe housing. The data, it's also sort of fluctuates, so depending on when sort of national lockdowns have eased, that we've sort of seen peaks and troughs. But really, I think, and again, speaking to Family and Children's Services colleagues as well as part of this, we all feel that we're really going to see that change once we actually come out of that lockdown. I think this has been such an unsettling period up and down the country, but once it sort of goes back to the new normal, as I've mentioned, we will be seeing the data more frankly. But the data still shows us that there is need and people are still coming forward, and our specialist services are seeing more come forward. So yes, sorry, that's a bit of a roundabout answer, and you've got other questions, so I'll let you come in.
I hear all that, but with respect, lockdown has ended.
Well, it has and it hasn't, in that not everyone's yet gone back to work. And also, the thing with lockdown and with violence against women and girls is we are conscious that with the impacts of violence against women and girls, people who've experienced abuse will experience it in that point of crisis, but the impact is also more long-term. So what we find is sometimes people don't reach out for help after directly experiencing abuse. They will reach out for support a few months down the line, a few years down the line, when they feel supported, when perhaps they feel they can reach out. So each journey is different, and although lockdown has ended, people's journeys are still quite different. And what we know from statistics, and again, as I mentioned before, people can experience up to 35 different experiences of abuse before reaching out. And so it's not an exact correlation, which is why the next few months, I think, will be very, very fascinating, and it's important that our strategy is prepared for that changing landscape.
If I may just add to that, I think that we haven't fully seen the results, the impacts, I should say, from COVID on community safety matters. So if I think about other crimes such as those who may be radicalised into terrorist views, there is a recognised risk that under COVID, people who are socially isolated may have radicalised themselves or be radicalised online. We haven't seen the results of that yet. There is a recognised heightened risk around that, but we haven't seen the results of that yet. And we probably will see the results of that over the next couple of years. So I think there is a sort of a lag, if you like, around the impacts of COVID on some crimes and criminality that we will regrettably see over the next couple of years. I suspect this is one of them as well. Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing this report, because I know how much work you've put into it, so thank you. I think one of the areas where I have concern is over housing. Certainly in my ward, I get a lot of housing issues from housing association, tenants of housing associations. And certainly we've seen an increase in antisocial behaviour, mental health issues, and substance misuse. But also repairs generally. The housing associations are really, really slow to respond. So my concern is that there may be something going on, but they're not being seen, it's not being picked up. So I just wondered, is there some additional work that could be done with the housing associations in particular? I mean, Stuart knows because I'm always emailing him about various things, but I do feel it's an area of weakness. Thank you.
Of course. So I wouldn't like to speak on the housing position just because I'm not part of that team, and I wouldn't do justice to the work that they're doing. But from a ward perspective and a community safety perspective, I absolutely agree. We need to make sure that people have the support that they need and feel safe within their homes. So one of the things that we have as part of the community safety team is the sanctuary scheme. So this is a process whereby victims who wish to remain in their home can get additional resource to help them be safe. So things like additional locks on doors, on windows, having alarms put in place, things that will help them feel safe. As part of the new Domestic Abuse Act as well, one of the interesting changes that we're seeing, which we're looking to implement locally, is when there is a domestic abuse incident, and again I'm focusing on domestic abuse, not the broader VOG strands, but if there is a domestic abuse incident in the home, what tends to happen is the first thing is victims are often the ones who leave the home. They may be the ones who go into refuge. Actually, what we're seeing in terms of a positive change is rather than ask the victims to move and uproot themselves, is to remove the abuser from the property. So there are new duties that the police will be assigned with to follow through, and that's a very welcome change, because actually what we find is it's very difficult for survivors of abuse to uproot their lives, to move to a new area, cut off from friends, sources of support, services, because they've experienced abuse, whereas the abuser's life in theory doesn't change. So that's a really welcome national government policy, which we think will help in terms of keeping victims safe in their homes. But just to echo the point I made earlier as well, I think what's also key is some of the projects that we're delivering linked in with housing. So the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance is important, because one of the things that we're doing is training workers who go into the property and do the repairs. If we identify domestic abuse earlier, we can offer that support at an earlier stage. And one of the things that we're conscious of is when workers go in to do building work, if they're not identifying abuse or not looking at the home through a domestic abuse lens, which is something which we focus on in the training, it may go missed. And so by raising that awareness, not just with your obvious frontline housing workers, but a range of different staff, we're hoping that victims and survivors will be brought to the attention of services sooner, and so they can get that support. I think that there's so much we can do with housing. Housing is a key partner. They are part of our VOG strategic board, but we also have a dedicated operational group for those conversations. So I mean, I know you said you email Stuart, but please email me. I'd love to connect with you to have a conversation on how we can address that better.
So I think I'd just very briefly add to that and say there are over 50 providers of housing within the borough, and amongst those 50 there will be a variation in approach and swiftness to respond to these type of issues. Part of our challenge, actually, and part of our responsibility is to try and work with those organisations through the partnership to improve the response across the piece, and that will be part of the strategy. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay. So thank you very much, Stuart and Shabana, for coming along and for bringing your strategy on violence against women. Obviously, it's a hugely important piece of work, and you've put a lot into it. And, you know, this is an eternal problem, and it is made more difficult because it's usually hidden. And, you know, it's complex, and there have to be kind of multifaceted ways of trying to solve it. But thank you so much for coming along and answering our questions tonight. Great. So we're moving on to A6, which is the scrutiny stock take, which, as you all know, we had a review by the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, looking at ways that we could improve and make suggestions, and that to say we are not standing still, and we are working to address many of the points that they raised with us. We did discuss this at our meeting on the 8th of July, and then also in July we had a workshop for all backbench councillors to discuss it. The difference of what we have in front of us tonight is we have our response, which is written at the end of it. So I don't know if anyone, if people would like to make any comments, again, on the stock take or our response, whatever. Mo.
Thank you, Chair. 3.12, the following page, there is a point saying consider appointing co-optees from appropriately constituted and representative relevant organizations for specific reviews. This is for working groups. In my view, working groups is a very important element of scrutiny because it will focus and concentrate on one or specific issue.
Yeah.
There will be some time to study any problem thoroughly. But I think I have mentioned this in other meetings. We have expertise amongst our communities which are not members of organizations. We need to find a way to reach out to them and allow them. They are not members of any organizations, but we have experts in all fields. We need to find a mechanism to include them in our working groups.
I think, Mo, that's right. We can actually co-opt people onto the working groups. Where I ran into difficulties before, on Janet's committee, she has co-opted members, but I found it, for some reason, I wasn't allowed to have co-optees on the other committees, but there's no restrictions, I don't think, on working groups. Jackie, can I get you to?
Yeah, we do have a policy that's on the website about co-optees to working groups, so I can send you that after the meeting. But I think in addition to co-optees, to reflect what you've said, it's really important when we have working groups that they consider how to involve different members of the community as well as co-optees, because some people might want to come to a session or contribute but might not want to be a co-optee, whereas others won't. So I think because the chair often says at these meetings that the role of scrutiny is to amplify the voice of residents, so I think we can definitely do that in the way that you're suggesting through involving residents. So Councillor Hammond here had his Healthy Homes working group last year, and he had a resident conference to get people involved, so that would be one example.
Yeah, then.
Yeah, but this point specifically mentions the co-optees from constituted and representative relevant organizations. I am talking about individuals who are not member of any organization. We need to find a way for them, I think.
As far as I know, there is no restriction in terms of working groups that you can co-opt onto it, and the person doesn't have to be from, you know, a specific or any kind of organisation. I mean, that's my understanding.
That's right. I'll send you the policy afterwards, and if anybody has a working group and they want to talk to me about it, any councillor on this committee or any of the select committees, I'm quite happy to talk through how it would work.
I think Will was first, then you, Greg. Sorry.
Yes, just by way of comment, there are other mechanisms open to us. I mean, this will not be a conclusive list by any means, but some that we've used, asking individuals to present to the evidence to committee if they wish to make a statement. Usually, I think it's controlled to up for about 5 minutes or so, but we've had several individuals come in. Sometimes they've been members of organisations, and sometimes they've been individuals who've been qualified in some sort of way, either by experience or their professionalism. Another one would be to get somebody to do a similar sort of thing, to join on a co-opted basis into a working group. But also one that we're going to be looking at soon is to go and visit into the community to a community group to ask them for them to self-select who they think are the people who represent points of view or expertise and experience in a particular issue. And then on a slightly different version of that is to invite people to come into a seminar at the town hall. So I think that if you ask the officers to enable something to happen, they will find a way. It might not be easy to source it in the protocols that are made public because they're a bit rigid. But if you say what you want as a solution and then ask the support officers to coordinate it for you, it will be possible to do.
Greg.
Thank you, Chair. The second set of boxes, shame there are no numbers on here, but it's on the second page and it's the top box. And it's the one that says the council continues to be engaged in a change process. It's that one. The action proposed by the Cfgs, it says the programme should focus on risks. Something I haven't been able to get my head around since I've been on this council is why the risk register doesn't get examined by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I know it's examined by the Audit and Transparency Committee, but it strikes me that there's quite a lot of overlap in the responsibilities of those committees, and of course Audit and Transparency presumably has a finance function, but risk, if you're going to run a big organisation, the risk register is critical to it, and if we're having supposed to have an overview of what the council's doing, I don't see how we can do that without seeing the risk register regularly, and certainly something I talked about in the report, which set up this current committee structure that we're operating. So I think that's something we perhaps ought to look at for the future. The second observation I have, I thought the RBKC response on the number of meetings was, if I may say so, a bit of a cop-out on extra meetings. The evidence I heard was, when I did that report, was that the select committees really needed 6 meetings a year, and the executive made it 4 meetings a year, not 5, which is quoted in here. And I know they have actually met 5 times, and 1 or 2 of them have met 6. But I think 6 is the right number as a minimum, and I think this committee, probably 8 to 10 is probably about right. And the third observation I had was I'm pleased to see what's being done on the master tracker of actions, which is another page on, but I've got some detailed comments on it, but I'll save that for the next item.
Say that for the next one. So just to answer you, I think you're absolutely right about the risk register. I do think that's something we should look at, unless there's a specific reason why we shouldn't, Jackie, or...
No, there's no reason. So we did use the risk register when putting together some of the suggestions for the work programme. The officers referenced it, and it was linked into the reports. But yeah, I think it's a point well made. So you would be looking at it from a scrutiny perspective rather than audit and transparency. But one way that you might use it, for example, is if a lead member came to a committee to present about their priorities for the year ahead, it would be considering how that links to the risk register. So I know that Adult Social Care and Health had the lead member presenting at the meeting on Thursday. I think it is a useful tool to scrutiny, so I'll have another look at that and come back with some ideas.
I think it might be a good idea just to bring it as an agenda item. I know the next meeting is very full, but maybe the one after that in December is not so full. That we could get an item on the agenda just to look at what was on the risk register.
Yeah, we can. And when Councillor Lindsay chaired Family Services a number of years ago, he asked that committee to have a particular focus on risk in its work programme, and the officers came and gave a presentation, but it was a few years ago, so I hope I haven't mentioned something you've forgotten.
Madam Chairman,
if I may,
So could we put that down for maybe December meeting, that we'll look at that? Now, I haven't finished Greg's question yet. The last time we met, and it must have been the 8th of July, no one seemed to have an appetite for an extra meeting, Greg, when we discussed it.
Can I go back to the risk register, though, because I think the idea of putting it in, it might be a good idea to combine it with the session with the leader and the chief executive, because it's an opportunity to ask them questions about the risk register. I mean, after the risk register should reflect the biggest problems for the borough and the council, and therefore that might be that opportunity. But David sits on the Audit and Transparency Committee and might be able to add something.
I just want to make a quick observation, Marie-Therese. You'll be aware that there have been discussions as to whether this committee and the Audit Committee can sit jointly to look at some of the costs relating to the Grenfell Tower recovery in particular, and associated with that community. it wouldn't be beyond the wit to have a joint committee meeting for the audit and transparency and the OSC each year, and it needn't necessarily be for the whole of the evening, but to have a joint meeting where items of importance could be discussed. The advantage of the audit meeting, the audit committee, discussing matters relating to risk is that there are several members on that committee who are professionally qualified and will bring a different perspective to ours. Our perspective, and okay, I speak as an accountant, will essentially be that of politicians with an intelligent layman's perspective. Theirs will be as professionals, certainly finance professionals, and in some cases...
David, can I interrupt you? We are not allowed to have a joint meeting with the audit committee. So what has been decided is this committee will be invited to a meeting of the audit committee will be on the 22nd of November, and it will be the first item, and we will look at the spending of Grenfell, but currently constitutionally we cannot have a joint meeting, is what I have been told. So I think, you know, to kind of, we have to on that particular issue, but I think we can look at risk in a different way. I accept that there are a lot of accountants and people who are expert in finance on that committee, on audit, but we're not looking at it from that point of view. So if we're amateurs, well, that's what we are throughout. Amateurs, really.
No, I appreciate that. I think all I'd say about if we're not allowed to have a joint meeting, a constitution is a good servant but a bad master.
Yeah, but it's not my decision, is it, David?
But we can seek to change it.
Madam Chairman, could...
Jackie? Sorry, I've got some advice on a joint meeting. So the advice I've had from the head of governance is there's no constitutional provision for a formal joint meeting, but there could be an informal joint meeting of both committees, or Audit and Transparency can meet formally and invite overview to that meeting. So I suppose it depends on how important you think this is as a formal meeting. So there are ways you can talk to each other and ways that you can meet as committees.
Will's been waiting patiently.
Yes, I used to chair the Audit and Transparency Committee, and we did have a few protocol-related issues with our governance. But bluntly speaking, the important thing is that the Council is best advised by its various committees according to their responsibilities. And there certainly should be communication between the different parts of the Council. It's absolutely essential. And a classical case, when I was chairing the Audit and Transparency, is when we found out from one of the other parts of the Council that there was an enormous risk that we were not aware of in Audit and Transparency. None of the audit professionals had any capability or professional qualification to be able to bring that perspective of risk. It had to come from people who understood what was happening in the wider world in an engineering basis. And that was put on the risk register as a result. Coming nearer to home here, this last year, ESC identified a very large financial risk that was not to the Council, that was not even on the radar set of Audit and Transparency. And when it had been communicated to the chairman there by me as chairman of ESC, they put it on the risk register and then asked officers to populate that risk with, you know, a professional assessment of what that risk would be in the perception of the officers. So that was the right way of going about it. But it's all to do with communication. And it's yet again an example where there are excellent things going on in this council, but very often it's siloed. And the lack of communication between the silos creates many of the problems that we have to live with as councillors and representatives of the people we represent in our wards. So I think it's absolutely vital that to take a halfway point between what governance has said and what David said about the Constitution should be the servants, as I intimated earlier on, we should ask officers in governance to find a way of providing the communication between the siloed departments of this council so that it performs better in the round and we fulfil our own sectored responsibilities, but also our collective responsibility to our residents.
Okay, I'm going to call Greg, and then I'm going to go to Kazim, and then I'm going to go to Janet.
Yeah,
Okay.
just a small follow-up point, agreeing with both Will and David. Risk is not necessarily a financial thing. I mean, Will's just given an example, a very good example of something that is financial, but risk could be reputational with no financial implications, and the solution might be financial or it might not be. So the audit committee is by no means the only place where risk is relevant. It's absolutely relevant to in other places.
Okay, Kazim.
Thank you. Speaking of the two committees to meet, I would say I definitely agree with the governance team that I think it's good to keep separate the two committees, and we have responsibilities as the chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. You do attend other meetings, and I think the way we're working now, of course, since the return of the Labour group to Scrutiny has been good, as it's been said here, the issues identified by the Central Governance and Scrutiny. I think if we add to another group or another committee, it will just, I would say, dilute or at least mixed results will come out of it. So I think the way it is now, we've just started about 18 months as we speak, the way it is now with you working with other committees, other chairs, is perhaps to leave it for the time being, rather than adding another committee so that we can have different responsibilities. But speaking of the last year, since the return of the Labour group, I think the scrutiny has worked, and I'm pleased to say some of the issues were not easy. However, it was good to see it was not down to the party lines, and despite the different colours and despite the different parties, we have worked well together, and I think that shows the commitment of the elected members of this council, and we should continue down that road rather than adding more committees to do joint work. We should stay separate, and if necessary, informal meetings to inform and to communicate, as Councillor Pascal said, is fine, but it should just be informal rather than formal meetings. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Kazim, and I think that's right. I mean, we are specifically coming together, however you describe it, with Audit Committee for a specific item on Grenfell and the spend on Grenfell, but I think besides that, we are two separate committees and we look at things in our different ways, and I think we should look at the risk register. Janet.
I'm listening to what everyone says, and I think the most productive at this point is to follow what the scrutiny officer has suggested. Informal meetings, with the root of the word inform, because that's exactly what we want, is to find out more information. And I think we should start with informal meetings. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll leave that. Does anyone have any other points of comments on the stock take? On anything? Okay. All right, we move on to the next item, which is A6, which is the annual scrutiny work programme. As you will see, I mean, Jackie has done an awful lot of work here, and you know, we are trying to get more organised. We now have a programme for the whole year of what the different committees are doing, and obviously that's not set in stone, and things will come up, and you know, reports won't be ready on time, but by and large we have a map of where we're intending to go. I think that should be sent, Jackie, to all the lead members and to the executive directors by email, so that they know what we're planning for the year. And I think that will help some of the issues we've had, yeah?
Yes, thanks, Chair. And just to confirm, we have had some conversations with officers to build this up, to find out when the right time for the scrutiny will be, when you can have most impact.
Yeah,
But as you've asked, Madam Chair, I will send that out after this meeting.
but I think it's good to have, like, you know, to try and set out what you're going to do at this meeting and that meeting, but obviously if something changes or comes up, you can be flexible as well. But I think it gives officers and lead members a better idea of where we're going, and I think that's quite helpful. And then coming on to the other piece of work, which is the tracker for recommendations, which I think is really good, and a lot of work has gone into that by Jackie. Looking through it, you'll see just how many of the recommendations have been picked up. Also, there are some which are empty, and that's because the timing of the actual meeting and when these papers were published, so we couldn't say accepted, but eventually, obviously it's a living document and it will be updated. And I also think there should be another column, which will take probably a bit more time, which will be implemented, because that's the real test. You know, if something's accepted, all well and good, and that's what we want to hear, but, you know, does it actually get done? And I think that's what we should be looking at. Greg.
Thanks, and I hugely welcome the work that Jackie's done to create this first draft of a master action tracker. But absolutely agree with you, Chair, about having another column. I think whether it's accepted or rejected by the executive is quite a small point. I mean it's worth having it there. But the next column should be a sort of what happened, and actually a short paragraph saying what the executive did with it. It's not just a one-word done or not. So it should be probably about the same sort of size as the recommendation box, so a short summary of what happened, and then a final column saying open or closed, and then the closed ones can be greyed out, and then you can see which ones are open. That would be, I think there was quite a good example in the Grenfell Committee in terms of the format that was used before that committee came to an end. The other question I've got, which is, well, actually two questions. It currently goes back probably 2 years, maybe. I wonder how far back we should go. Should we go back to the beginning of this council term, because there are some from the previous set of committees? And then the other, it's more of a question here, the last page, there's some recommendations for outside bodies. Can we actually, do we have the power to give them recommendations? I mean, these are health ones in Marwan's area, but can we recommend things to them? They're not in our gift, surely.
I think I don't know how to be, I think with health there were statutory reasons where maybe we can, I don't know.
We'll leave that hanging
I mean,
to
Jackie or
investigate.
maybe Sarah can answer. Jackie.
Yeah, we can make recommendations to external partner organisations. The CCG actually attended the Adult Social Care and Health Scrutiny Committee on Thursday, and they gave a response to each of the recommendations, but this is blank because of what the Chair said about the timing, so that will be filled in. So we made the recommendations to the Brompton, but they didn't relate to statutory health scrutiny. It wasn't a statutory matter when they were looking at the merger. It was something that members of all parties felt very strongly that they wanted to do, to have that meeting. So we can't compel them, but we would hope that they would respond. So we'll come back on that. But I think all of the CCG ones, I'll check, but from memory they did accept them, but we'll get that filled in. But when the borough commander comes for the annual scrutiny, because that's statutory scrutiny, you have more power there.
David.
Thank you, Chairman. I thought Greg's point when he asked the question about how far back we should go was very pertinent. I would certainly like to see it go back to the beginning of this election phase of 2018. And if you have a young gopher who is underemployed, an apprentice or whatever, I wouldn't be averse to it going back a little bit further even than that. But that is, with the priority, I think, will be going back to 2018. and as Greg said, a couple of extra columns, clearly, and there will be a difference about how much it's been implemented, because some of it is actually implementation at the heart level as to whether the culture has actually changed. It's very easy to do things, to do a reconciliation that hasn't been done before. Anyone can do that, but to engage with care and compassion and authoritatively and all the other ways in which it should be done properly is a much more difficult and high standard.
David, I remember going back into the midst of time of doing a working group and having about 10 recommendations and being told I could have one. And I think we have come on a lot from there. But yes, it's a question of how much work this is going to take and whether, you know, we've got the capacity to do it. Jackie, that's kind of... Greg?
Well, wholly agreeing with David. I mean, this is about holding the executive to account. So if you don't know what you've recommended to them, you can't keep track of what they're doing with it.
I'm just talking about going backwards rather than forwards, whether we have the capacity to go backwards as well as, you know, looking at what's coming up
absolutely.
down the line.
I mean, agreeing with David, I think when I was doing the Scrutiny review a couple of years ago, I was quite struck by some of the recommendations from one of the, I'm afraid I've forgotten the name of the Scrutiny committee that Pat Mason chaired. Well, it wasn't called Overview and Scrutiny. It was
Cabinet and Corporate Services.
That's the one, but there were some quite good recommendations from that committee that were fairly recent to 2018, but maybe 2 years before I was elected. That's the kind of thing I wouldn't have wanted to get lost, but I mean, appreciate it for it's how much capacity Jackie's got and how far back into the midst of time do we go. But
I mean, I agree with you entirely that it's you know, is it implemented and how is it implemented? Yeah. That's the thing. Accepted is quite easy.
Yes.
And that's what we've really got to focus on. And I can't say how much time Jack has got to go backwards. That's.
If there was a choice, I would add the extra columns with the detail rather than going back in time.
Well, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that is essential. And yes, it would be nice to go backwards because, therefore, we can compare and say, oh look, we're doing much better now. And actually, we have got some money, Jackie. Perhaps we could spend some money on that.
Chair,
the budget that we've got, and actually get someone, if people think it's important, get someone who will work on that with Jackie to sort it out. David?
All I was going to say is, yes, I do think it's important, but I think seeing the degree to which recommendations are now implemented would be a good test and evidence of the degree to which there has been genuine culture change. Culture, I mean, it's much more than that, but that would be a manifestation that actually we are much better at taking on board scrutiny recommendations than perhaps we were.
So maybe if I have your agreement...
Chair, could I possibly make a...
Can I just finish? If you all agree, then we have a budget that we haven't utilised that we could use to get someone to do this work, if people think it's important. Yeah? Will?
Look, if I could say something first, because you've had 3 conversations with Greg and I've been trying to say one thing. The point I want to make is a practical example. We've got coming up on our agenda on this committee, Coming Up in the Future, is about flooding. We had a scrutiny of flooding some time back, and there is recommendations and evidence that's been produced as papers as background to this next meeting. It's a classical case of having it on this chart would be extremely useful, because some of these things, some of these issues we relate internally and externally come back again. And because some of the recommendations were not taken up last time, we're being faced with the issues on flooding that we are now. And that's presumably part of why we're going to be bringing Thames Water, etc., back for further discussions and scrutiny. So having that chart there would be a very good tool for us to inform our future way forward from our past knowledge.
If that could be distributed for that meeting, that would be a very, very good thing. I know my residents, and my residents were affected would be extremely grateful.
There was a specific line of recommendations made by my predecessor on ESC to Thames Water, which were answered in a way that gave guarantees of the future-proofing of the flooding provision. And I think that that set of recommendations that was made from that committee and apparently accepted or applied to at the time proves exactly the point that we need the backward-looking to get the forward probity.
Okay,
Thank you.
Kazim.
Thank you. On the issue of that we're going to talk about, hopefully discuss on the 11th of October, I think we should leave it to that day, but I think it will be good to discuss when the time comes about the issues of flooding and other issues. But I do agree with councillors when they mention the time length of going back to 2018 is about right. But when it comes to spending money on the money we have for scrutiny to get someone to work on it, that's another issue. Perhaps we should look into that if Jackie can get other officers to work on it, but time will tell. We had in here, as says 3.3, we had the overview scrutiny committee and the meeting on the 8th of July, and we've agreed the work program of what we were going to do. For example, we had a work program for us to do a working group, but then the committee decided, and because of the election years coming up, we don't have the time and the capacity to do a working group. So we've changed that to a one-day conference, which obviously requires budgeting and money will be spent on if hopefully we will get ahead with this. I would say we should show flexibility in terms of the type of scrutiny we're doing, because of scrutiny is a living thing. We just have to adapt. Flooding was not part of it, but now it's part of the agenda we're doing. And I think it will be good our committee to look ahead and at the same time be flexible with the type of scrutiny we're providing. And I hope other chair and other members of the committee to agree on the conference we've suggested at the last Housing and Communities, which will happen sometime in January or February, the latest, no later than that, to look into the communities side rather than setting up a working group. But we have a one-day conference where we will look into every aspect, or at least the main point of communities, whether it's Grenfell Assembly spending, whether it's food insecurity, or any other issue, or how we fund organizations, how we support local organizations that have been supporting our local residents from COVID to Grenfell and now Afghan crisis. And I think it will be important for this committee to show flexibility and their leadership. And I hope that the committee will agree to be flexible and support that kind of scrutiny, which is obviously down to their officers for their support and their suggestions. And I have accepted as a chair, and I'm pleased to say the committee and the vice chair have accepted last meeting. And I hope this committee will agree with that and be ready to fund for that kind of a one-day scrutiny, specializing or looking deep into one working group rather than, one community lead member rather than both housing and communities. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine, Kazim, and I know that this is a short year, so I can understand why, working groups aren't going to have that much time to kind of produce their reports. I understand that.
Absolutely.
Janet.
I'm listening to everyone, and I like what Will said. Because of our limited capacity, rather than look at everything, which is also what Ed said in his report to us, that we shouldn't go overbroad because nothing will get done, I like the approach that Will had of doing it on an ad hoc basis where we actually have evidence that we prepared before and recommendations and what we're doing now. I think that would be a more practical approach. Thank you.
Anyone have any more comments? Okay, so yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, we would go backwards and then we would go forward and we would have everything. Whether we can do that without getting an extra member of staff, I don't know. So we'll just have to leave it.
What's the outcome as to whether we use some money in the budget?
I think some people didn't agree, David. I think Councillor
Jackie wants.
Yeah, I think it is a really good idea to go back to 2018. So I'll see what information I've got and what we can do, and I can come back, because I think the next meeting's just about flooding, but I can come back to the next meeting. I'll try and make some progress, but I think because this committee has that responsibility within its terms of reference to look at the effectiveness of scrutiny, then that's one way to do it. I'd also like to add some more analysis to the report, which I talked to the chair about when preparing it. So next time it'll be the information that you've asked for about the responses, but some analysis about not numbers but percentages. You know, recommendations made, percentage accepted, partially accepted, and that way you can get more of an idea about how about the cultural change that you've been talking about. But this time the focus was just on getting the list together, but I will improve it with the suggestions. So I think we can go back to 2018, but I need to have a think outside of the meeting about, I need to look at how much of that information I've got and how much work it is, but if that's what the committee's asking me to do, then we will definitely do that.
I think it would be definitely helpful to look up the flooding stuff. I think that would be very helpful.
I've got that because that was, the flooding is part of scrutiny's, that's one of the 3 statutory scrutiny areas, the flooding. So I have that information from the meeting in 2019, I was there. So I can find that information. I think Councillor Pascal's pulled some stuff together as well from the meeting, and I can circulate that to members with a briefing note on what was done there in advance of the meeting on October the 11th.
But one of Ed's bits of advice or recommendations to us involved us having extra, officers, and I think you have to kind of think about, yes, we're not necessarily in a position to suddenly get an extra officer. So if people were minded to spend some of the budget to help get someone to do, I don't know, part-time or something, working on that. I mean, I would agree with it.
I would support too as well. It's a
Okay.
I think it would be.
Madam Chairman, I think if I could clarify something I said earlier on, is that when I reported, when I was on the flooding thing, basically I found out as much information as I could collate in the ESC and provided it through Jackie to this committee, because the flooding coming to this committee. So it was really a question of looking back at ESC's work on flooding and supplying that to this committee. And I think that the point there is that it's an ad hoc thing. It's as Janet was pointing out, that if there's a particular reason to have a focus on some information, like on flooding, because we got it on the agenda, we should look backwards. And if that previous meeting on flooding had happened back in 2010, we should also have access to that information as well, as far as we can through the officer corps. But I think the key here is to have as Greg Hammond was saying, the going through to implementation or degree of implementation or something that sort, because some of these things are very long term.
Thames Water said they were going to expand that counter-screen, and they went back on it.
Yes, they did. But
the thing is, we can't. It's not like lead member refusing to do something. That's Thames Water. We can only sort of.
No. But the key thing to my mind is not whether they changed their mind, because they may have had good technical reasons for doing it, but they gave an undertaking that what they were proposing to put in place for expanding that sewer was a 30-year standard, and here we are a short number of years afterwards where we've had distinct failures. They're now claiming that it's not a failure of their system, that it's some kind of external event to their activities. And this is going to Ofwat and all sorts of things, but we have to understand, as a statutory authority here, in this context, as to what is actually going on, and hold them to account to explain it.
And that is why we're having.
Yes, exactly. But I think in relation to the reporting of previous scrutiny, which it was, that a rear view access to information, be it to the last election or previously if need be, but only perhaps on certain cases, is essential to having a good background foundation to be able to look forward in terms of our scrutiny, because it informs it.
Okay. So if we have no further comments, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming tonight, and yeah, see you on the 11th of October. And I think we'll make sure that some reports are sent round, some information is sent round before that meeting, so that they can have a good look at it. Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.